Welcome to Mr. Nightveil. Tonight, I'm bringing you 10 deeply disturbing true stories from flight attendants who experienced absolute terror at 30,000 feet. These accounts are completely real, though names and certain identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. From passengers who shouldn't exist to rituals performed mid-flight, these stories will make you think twice about your next journey. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. If you're ready for true horror from the skies, hit that subscribe button and let's dive into the darkness together. My name is Alexis, and I've been a flight attendant for 11 years. I've worked red-eyes, holiday rushes, and every kind of turbulence you can imagine. I've handled medical emergencies, drunk passengers, and even helped deliver a baby at 35,000 feet. But what happened on a routine evening flight from Denver International Airport in March 2018 wasn't something my training prepared me for. It wasn't something anyone could prepare for. I still fly, but I avoid certain routes now. And I've learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you see, but what other people can't see when you're looking right at it. It was a Tuesday evening. Nothing special about the day. The flight was scheduled to depart at 6:45 p.m., heading to Boston. We had a full cabin, which was typical for that route. I remember the pre-flight checks being completely normal. The aircraft was a 737, and I'd worked that same plane dozens of times before. The smell of fresh coffee brewing in the galley mixed with the recycled air and that distinct airplane cleaning product scent. Everything felt routine. I was working with Rowan, another senior flight attendant who'd been with the airline even longer than me. We'd flown together countless times, and we had that easy rhythm that comes from years of experience. During boarding, I noticed a passenger in seat 7C. He was a businessman, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a dark gray suit with a blue tie. He had reading glasses perched on his nose and was already absorbed in the Wall Street Journal before we even finished boarding. He smiled politely when I greeted him, asked for a ginger ale when I came around for pre-departure beverages. His voice was pleasant, with a slight southern accent. Nothing about him stood out as unusual. Just another business traveler heading home or to a meeting. I remember thinking he looked tired, the way most of our weekday passengers do. We pushed back from the gate on time. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the usual announcements about flight time and weather conditions. The engines hummed to life with that familiar vibration through the cabin floor. I was in the jump seat for takeoff, going through my mental checklist, watching passengers settle in. The man in 7C had put away his newspaper and was looking out the window as we taxied. Everything was completely, perfectly normal. About 90 minutes into the flight, I was doing the main cabin service. Rowan was handling first class while I took care of economy with the beverage cart. The overhead lights cast that yellowish glow they always do, and I could hear the steady rumble of the engines, the occasional ding of a call button, the low murmur of passenger conversations. I was working my way down the aisle, smiling, asking passengers what they wanted to drink, handing out pretzels and cookies. When I reached row 23, I looked up to ask the passenger in 23F what he wanted. My hands froze on the cart handle. It was him, the businessman from 7C. Same gray suit, same blue tie, same reading glasses, same Wall Street Journal open in his lap. He looked up at me and smiled the exact same polite smile. My heart started pounding. I felt this cold sensation wash over my skin, like someone had opened a door to winter. He asked for a ginger ale, in that same pleasant voice with a slight southern accent. The exact same drink. I stood there, unable to move, staring at him. He tilted his head slightly, confused by my reaction. "Just a ginger ale, please," he repeated, a bit uncertain now. I heard myself say something, probably apologizing, and I poured his drink with shaking hands. The plastic cup rattled against the cart. I could taste something metallic in my mouth, that tang you get when fear really hits. I moved to the next row mechanically, but my mind was racing. I had to check. I had to see if the man was still in 7C. My stomach was churning as I finished the row, and then I told the passengers I'd be right back. I walked quickly toward the front of the cabin, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. Seat 7C. He was still there. Same man, same suit, same newspaper. He was eating the pretzels I'd given him during the earlier service. He didn't look up as I passed. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. The textured plastic felt real enough, cool under my palm. I could smell the coffee again from the galley and the faint scent of someone's perfume. Everything felt normal except for the impossible thing I was seeing. I walked back to row 23. The man was still there too, now drinking his ginger ale, looking completely real and solid. I found Rowan in the galley. He was restocking cups and napkins, humming something under his breath. I grabbed his arm, probably harder than I should have. "Rowan, I need you to do something for me. Don't ask questions. Just look at seat 7C and tell me what you see." He gave me a strange look, clearly concerned by whatever he saw in my face. "Alexis, are you okay? You look pale." I insisted, my voice coming out more desperate than I intended. "Please, just look." We walked to where he could see row 7. He looked at 7C for a long moment, then turned back to me with worry creasing his forehead. "It's empty. That seat has been empty the whole flight. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down?" I felt the floor seem to tilt beneath my feet. "What do you mean empty? There's a man sitting right there. Gray suit, blue tie, reading the Wall Street Journal." Rowan looked again, then looked at me with genuine concern now. "Alexis, there's nobody there. The seat is empty. The tray table is up. There's no newspaper, no passenger. Are you sure you're okay?" I looked at 7C again. He was still there. I could see him so clearly. He was real. I could see the wrinkles in his suit jacket, the way his reading glasses reflected the overhead light. As I watched, he turned a page of the newspaper. The paper made that crisp, rustling sound. I heard it. But Rowan couldn't see any of it. I felt panic rising in my chest like ice water. "Check seat 23F, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what you see in 23F. We moved down the aisle together. Rowan looked at 23F and nodded. Middle-aged businessman, gray suit, reading the newspaper. He's the one who ordered ginger ale, right? I stared at the man in 23F. He looked up and smiled politely at both of us. Then I looked back toward the front of the cabin. The man in 7C was still visible to me, still sitting there, still reading. "Rowan," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "The man you see in 23F, is he wearing a blue tie?" He glanced back. "Yes. Blue tie. Why?" I couldn't explain it. I didn't even try. I told him I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie. My hands were trembling, and I felt nauseous. He told me to sit in the jump seat for a while, and he'd finish the service. I sat there for the rest of the flight, watching both seats. The man in 7C never moved differently from the man in 23F. When one took a sip of his drink, so did the other. When one adjusted his reading glasses, the other did too, at the exact same moment. It was like watching a mirror, except they were seats apart and facing different directions. Other passengers walked past 7C without reacting, without seeing anything unusual. The seat appeared empty to everyone but me. We started our descent into Boston. I had to pull myself together for landing procedures. I checked both seats during my aisle walk. Both men were there, both fastening their seatbelts at the same time, both putting their tray tables up in perfect synchronization. The landing was smooth. The captain's voice thanked everyone for flying with us. Passengers started gathering their belongings from the overhead bins. I positioned myself where I could watch both seats. The man in 7C stood up. At the exact same moment, the man in 23F stood up. They moved into the aisle on opposite ends of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. They were both going to walk toward the exit, toward the middle of the plane. They were going to pass each other. I watched, unable to breathe, as they walked down the aisle. The man from 7C was coming from the front. The man from 23F was coming from the back. Other passengers moved around them, between them. And then they were feet apart. 3 feet, 2 feet. They passed each other in the aisle. Neither one reacted. They didn't look at each other, didn't acknowledge each other in any way. They walked past each other like strangers, like one of them wasn't even there. I felt dizzy. The cabin suddenly felt too hot, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. Both men continued to the exit. I stood at the door, saying goodbye to passengers with a smile that felt frozen on my face. The man from 23F deplaned, thanking me pleasantly. 30 seconds later, the man from 7C walked past me, also thanking me, also smiling politely. Watched them both walk up the jetway. 2 identical men in gray suits with blue ties, carrying the same briefcase, walking one behind the other into the terminal. After every passenger had deplaned, I checked the flight manifest on my tablet with shaking hands. Seat 23F was listed as occupied. There was a name, a booking confirmation, everything normal. Seat 7C showed as empty. No booking, no name, no record of anyone sitting there. I asked Rowan if he remembered boarding a passenger in 7C. He checked his boarding notes and shook his head. No one sat there. It's been empty since Denver. But I had seen him board. I had served him a ginger ale before takeoff. I had watched him read his newspaper. He had been as real as anything else on that plane. The airline found nothing wrong during the post-flight inspection. The seat functioned normally. There was no maintenance issue. I filed an incident report, but I kept it vague, saying I'd experienced some confusion during the flight, possibly due to fatigue. I didn't mention seeing the same passenger in 2 seats. I didn't mention that no one else could see what I saw. I knew how that would sound. It's been years now, and I still can't explain what happened. I've researched that flight, that aircraft, that route. I've found nothing unusual in the history. No accidents, no incidents, no reports of anything strange. I've tried to find information about the passenger in 23F, but the airline wouldn't share details due to privacy policies. I still fly, but I requested to be taken off the Denver to Boston route. When I work flights now, I find myself watching the passengers more carefully, wondering if I'll see it again. Wondering if one of them is sitting in 2 places at once, and I'm the only one who can tell. I've never told Rowan the full story. I've never told anyone, really, until now. But I know what I saw. I know that man was in both seats, and I know that whatever the explanation is, it's not one that makes sense in the world I thought I understand. Sometimes late at night, I still wonder about him. Was he real? Were there really 2 of him? Or was something wrong with me that day, some glitch in my perception? But the manifest doesn't lie. No one was ever booked in seat 7C. So if no one was there, who did I see? And who walked past me on that jetway, following himself into the terminal, into a world where impossible things apparently happen every day at 30,000 feet. My name is Silas, and I've been a flight attendant for 16 years. September 2003 was when everything changed for me. I was based out of LaGuardia Airport in New York, working the red-eye routes that most crew members tried to avoid. The pay was slightly better, and I didn't mind the odd hours. I was young then, ambitious, thinking I'd seen everything the job could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened on that flight broke something in my understanding of reality. And even now, over 2 decades later, I wake up at exactly 2:47 a.m. sometimes, drenched in sweat, reliving those moments that shouldn't have been possible. It was a red-eye flight scheduled to depart at 11:30 p.m., heading to Seattle. The aircraft was an older 737, and I remember the cabin had that worn smell of thousands of flights, recycled air mixed with old upholstery and cleaning chemicals. We had maybe 60 passengers, which was light for that route. Most of them were business travelers trying to sleep through the flight, a few college kids heading back to school. The pre-flight briefing was routine. The captain mentioned some possible turbulence over the Midwest, nothing unusual for that time of year. My coworker that night was Isaiah, a newer flight attendant who'd only been flying for about 8 months. He was eager, maybe a little too chatty, but good at his job. We pushed back from the gate on time. The lights of New York stretched out below us as we climbed, eventually giving way to darkness. I did the safety demonstration while Isaiah checked that everyone had their seatbelts fastened. The passengers settled in quickly, most of them pulling out neck pillows and eye masks before we even reached cruising altitude. The cabin lights dimmed to that low blue glow we use for night flights. Everything was textbook normal. I remember thinking it would be an easy shift. Around 2:30 a.m., most of the cabin was asleep. Isaiah and I were in the galley, talking quietly about his plans to transfer to international routes. The engines hummed steadily, that constant white noise you stop noticing after years of flying. Then I felt it. A slight drop, like the plane had hit a pocket of air. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional, asking everyone to remain seated and keep their belts fastened. We were hitting some unexpected turbulence. I'd heard that announcement 1,000 times. I secured the galley cart and took my jump seat. Isaiah sat across from me, still looking relaxed. The turbulence started gradually. Small bumps, nothing alarming. A few passengers stirred in their seats, but most stayed asleep. Then it got worse. The plane began to shake more violently. I could hear the overhead bins rattling, items shifting inside them. The air conditioning vent above my head was vibrating so hard it made a high-pitched whining sound. I gripped the armrests of my jump seat, watching the cabin. This was stronger than normal turbulence, but still within the range of what I'd experienced before. Then I saw him. A passenger in row 14, aisle seat. He was unbuckled, standing up, reaching for the overhead bin. Everything happened so fast. The plane dropped suddenly, violently. My stomach lurched into my throat. The man in row 14 was thrown upward, his head smashing into the overhead bin with a sickening crack that I heard even over the roar of the engines and the screaming wind outside. He dropped back down, his body crumpling into the aisle. Blood spread across the gray carpet in a dark stain. People started screaming. The turbulence continued, the plane bucking and shaking. I tried to unbuckle to get to him, but another violent jolt slammed me back into my seat. I could see his face from where I sat. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them anymore. He was gone. The next thing I remember is darkness. Complete, total darkness. And then I was opening my eyes in the crew briefing room at LaGuardia. The clock on the wall said 9:15 p.m. Isaiah was sitting next to me, going through the pre-flight checklist. The captain was talking about possible turbulence over the Midwest. Every word was identical to what I'd heard before. I felt cold all over, that deep cold that comes from the inside. I stood up so fast, my chair fell backward. Everyone looked at me. "What's wrong?" Isaiah asked, concerned. I couldn't speak. I was looking at the clock, at the date display beneath it. September 23rd, 2003. The same date, the same night. I told them I was sick, that I needed to go home. But even as I said it, I felt this pulling sensation, like I was being dragged forward through time. The briefing room started to fade, and then I was on the plane again, mid-flight, sitting in my jump seat. The turbulence was starting. I could hear the overhead bins rattling. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I looked at row 14. The man was sitting there, buckled in, asleep. I knew what was about to happen. I unbuckled and moved toward him, stumbling as the plane shook. "Sir," I said, shaking his shoulder. "Sir, you need to stay seated. Keep your seatbelt on." He looked at me, confused and annoyed at being woken up. The turbulence was getting worse. I practically pushed him back into his seat, checking his seatbelt twice. The violent drop came. The plane fell, and I was thrown against the ceiling. Pain exploded through my shoulder as I crashed back down into the aisle. But the man in row 14 was secured in his seat. He was alive. The turbulence continued for another minute, then gradually subsided. The captain's voice came on, apologizing for the rough air. Passengers were shaken, but okay. Isaiah helped me up, asking if I was hurt. I told him I was fine, but I wasn't. Because I remembered. I remembered seeing that man die. I remembered the blood on the carpet. But it hadn't happened. I'd stopped it. Then darkness again. And I was back in the briefing room. Same clock, same date, same time. The captain was starting his speech about turbulence over the Midwest. I felt like I was losing my mind. Isaiah looked at me. "You okay? You look pale." I couldn't do this again. I couldn't. But I had no choice. The pull came again, dragging me forward, and I was on the plane. The turbulence was starting. This time I tried something different. I went to the cockpit, knocked urgently. The co-pilot opened the door. "We need to change altitude," I said. "The turbulence is going to be severe." He looked at me skeptically. "We've already adjusted our route based on the weather reports. We'll be fine." He closed the door. I went back to my seat. The violent turbulence hit. This time I'd secured myself better, but I watched helplessly as the man in row 14 unbuckled and stood up. The plane dropped. He hit his head. The blood spread. He died. Darkness. Briefing room. Again. I tried to count how many times I'd lived through this. Was it 4 times? 5? I was losing track. Each loop was slightly different in small ways. But the outcome was always the same, unless I directly intervened. But even when I saved the man in row 14, the loop continued. I started to realize that saving him wasn't the point. Something else was happening. During the 7th or 8th loop, I started paying attention to other details. There was a woman in row 9 who always clutched a photograph during the turbulence. A teenager in row 22 who prayed in whispered Spanish. An older man in first class who never seemed afraid, who watched the chaos with strange, calm eyes. I tried everything. I tried warning the captain before we even took off. I tried calling in sick so I wouldn't be on the flight. But every time, I ended up back in that briefing room, pulled forward into the flight, living through those same terrible moments at 2:47 a.m. The turbulence, the screaming, the blood. I became desperate, erratic. During one loop, I grabbed the intercom and started screaming at passengers to stay seated, to hold on, that something terrible was coming. They thought I was having a breakdown. Security met the plane when we landed. But then the loop reset anyway, and none of it had happened. I don't know which loop it was when things finally changed. Maybe the 15th, maybe the 20th. I'd stopped trying to prevent the death. I'd stopped trying to change anything. I just sat in my jump seat during the turbulence, watching it all happen with numb acceptance. The man in row 14 stood up. The plane dropped. But this time, something was different. He stumbled but caught himself on the seat back. His head missed the overhead bin by inches. He fell back into his seat, shaken but alive. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't intervened. It just happened differently on its own. The turbulence subsided. The captain apologized over the intercom. We landed in Seattle without incident. I waited for the darkness, for the reset, for the briefing room. It didn't come. We deplaned normally. I went to the hotel with Isaias. I slept for 12 hours straight, and when I woke up, time had moved forward. It was the next day. The loop was over. I never told anyone the full truth about that night. How could I? I filed a report about experiencing severe stress during the turbulence. Took a week off. Saw a counselor who prescribed medication for anxiety. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. I'd lived through the same hours over and over, watching a man die again and again, trying desperately to change something I had no power to change. The only thing I can't figure out is why it finally stopped. Was it because I gave up trying to control it? Was it random? Or was something else at play that I still don't understand? I still fly red-eyes sometimes, though I avoid that particular route when I can. I still wake up at 2:47 a.m., my heart racing, feeling phantom turbulence that isn't there. And sometimes, when I'm walking through an airport or sitting in a hotel room, I see him. The man from row 14. Just a glimpse in a crowd, or passing by a gate. And I wonder if he remembers. If somewhere in his mind, he died 15 or 20 times before finally surviving. If he feels it too, that strange weight of living through moments that both did and didn't happen. I'll never know. But I know that time isn't as solid as we think it is. I know that some nights at 30,000 feet, reality becomes thin and flexible, and sometimes you can get caught in the cracks, living the same nightmare over and over until something finally lets you go. My name is Andy, and I've been a senior flight attendant for 19 years. June 2015 is a month I'll never forget, no matter how much I've tried. I was based out of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, working long-haul flights that crossed multiple time zones. I'd seen a lot in my career, handled every kind of emergency you can imagine, from medical crises to engine failures. I thought I was prepared for anything. But what happened on that flight from Atlanta taught me that there are things in this world that don't fit into any training manual. Things that make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. It was a night flight, scheduled to depart at 10:15 p.m., heading to Los Angeles. The aircraft was a wide body, one of the newer models with updated interiors and better cabin pressure systems. We had a full passenger load, about 240 people, mostly business travelers and families heading west. The pre-flight briefing was routine. The captain mentioned smooth weather conditions, no turbulence expected, an easy flight. I was working with Zane, a flight attendant who'd been with the airline for about 6 years. He was reliable, professional, someone I'd worked with many times before. We had our usual pre-flight rhythm down, checking emergency equipment, reviewing passenger manifests, making sure everything was secured properly. Boarding went smoothly. Passengers filed in, stowing their carry-ons, settling into their seats. I remember helping an elderly woman find her seat in the bulkhead, and a young mother who needed an extra blanket for her toddler. Normal interactions, the kind I'd had thousands of times. We pushed back from the gate, right on schedule. The engine started with that familiar low rumble that vibrates through the entire airframe. I was in my jump seat for takeoff, watching the lights of Atlanta fall away beneath us as we climbed into the dark sky. Everything felt perfectly routine. About 2 hours into the flight, we were deep into the meal service. The cabin was dimly lit, that soft amber glow we use during dinner service. The smell of heated chicken and pasta filled the air, mixing with coffee brewing in the galley. I was in the rear galley, restocking beverage carts, when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it under the constant hum of the engines. Crying. An infant crying, that distinctive newborn wail that every parent recognizes. But it was wrong. The sound wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from below me, from beneath the galley floor. I stopped moving, listening carefully. There it was again, muffled but unmistakable. A baby crying from somewhere in the cargo hold. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm cabin air. I stepped into the aisle and found Zane coming toward me with an empty tray. "Do you hear that?" I asked him quietly. He paused, tilting his head. "Hear what?" I gestured downward. "Listen. From below. A baby crying." He stood still for a moment, and I watched his expression change as he picked up the sound. His eyes widened slightly. "That's coming from the cargo hold?" he said, keeping his voice low so passengers wouldn't hear. We both knew that didn't make sense. There shouldn't be any crying coming from down there. I pulled out my tablet and checked the passenger manifest. We had exactly 4 infants on board, all accounted for and visible in the cabin with their parents. I could see them from where I stood. 3 were sleeping. 1 was being fed by her mother in row 23. None of them were crying. The sound from below continued, growing slightly louder. It wasn't constant. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. That desperate newborn wail that triggers something instinctive in people. Zane went to check with the lead flight attendant while I stayed near the galley, listening. The sound was definitely getting louder. Some passengers were starting to notice, looking around with confused expressions, trying to figure out where the crying was coming from. A woman in row 32 called me over. "Is there a baby in the bathroom?" she asked. "It sounds like it's coming from below us." I assured her everything was fine, but my hands were shaking as I walked back to the galley. The lead attendant came back with Zane. She was a veteran, 25 years with the airline, someone who never panicked. But I could see tension in her jaw as she listened to the crying. She went to the cockpit and used the internal phone to speak with the captain. When she came back, her face was pale. The captain confirmed there's cargo in the hold, medical transport, a sealed container being sent to the CDC in Los Angeles. He's trying to get more information about what's in it. Medical transport to the CDC? Those words settled in my stomach like ice. The crying continued, but now it sounded different. More frantic, more urgent. And underneath it, I started to hear something else. A scraping sound. Metal on metal. Something was moving down there. Several passengers were definitely aware now. I could see them unbuckling their seatbelts, standing up, trying to figure out what was happening. The mother with the toddler in first class looked terrified. "What is that sound?" she demanded. "What's down there?" Then the temperature dropped. I'm not talking about a slight chill. The cabin temperature plummeted at least 20 degrees in the span of maybe 30 seconds. I could see my breath misting in the air. Passengers started pulling out blankets, confused and frightened. The overhead vents were blasting cold air that felt like it was coming from a freezer. Zane grabbed my arm. "Andy, look at the floor." I looked down. The metal floor panel near the galley was vibrating. Not from engine vibration. This was different. Rhythmic, like something was hitting it from underneath. The scraping sound grew louder. It sounded like claws on metal, or something sharp being dragged across the cargo hold ceiling. The crying had become shrieking now, that sound rising to an inhuman pitch that made my teeth ache. Passengers were panicking. A man in row 30 was shouting, demanding to know what was happening. Parents were holding their children close. I heard someone praying in Spanish. The lead attendant got back on the phone with the cockpit. I saw her face go white as she listened to whatever the captain was telling her. She hung up and turned to us. "The captain is declaring an emergency. We're diverting to the nearest airport for an immediate landing. He said the cargo manifest lists the container as biological specimen, requires extreme caution handling, and it's supposed to be in a sealed, refrigerated unit." Her voice was shaking. "He said it should not be making any sound. Whatever is in that container should not be alive." The scraping beneath the floor became violent. The metal panel I'd been standing near suddenly bulged upward, the bolts straining. I jumped back, my heart hammering. Something was trying to get through. Something was trying to claw its way up from the cargo hold into the cabin. I could see the metal bending, warping. Deep scratches appeared on the surface, gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with multiple razor-sharp talons. Zane and I started moving passengers away from the galley area, toward the front of the cabin. People were crying, some were screaming. A teenager recorded everything on his phone until his father made him put it away. The shrieking from below reached a crescendo that hurt my ears, and then suddenly stopped. Complete silence except for the engines and the terrified passengers. The temperature was still freezing. I could see frost forming on the windows. The metal floor panels stopped bulging. Whatever had been trying to break through had stopped. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained but controlled. "Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. We'll be on the ground in 8 minutes." 8 minutes felt like 8 hours. We went through emergency procedures on autopilot, making sure everyone was buckled in, securing loose items, preparing for a rough landing. The whole time, I kept watching that damaged floor panel, expecting it to burst open at any second. But nothing else happened. The silence from below was somehow worse than the crying and scraping had been. We landed hard at a regional airport in eastern New Mexico. Emergency vehicles were already waiting, lights flashing in the darkness. The moment we stopped on the runway, the captain's voice came on. "Everyone remain seated. Do not deplane. Emergency personnel are boarding the aircraft." Armed response teams in full hazmat suits came through the doors, not regular paramedics or firefighters. These people had military-grade equipment, weapons, and biohazard containment gear that looked like something from a science fiction movie. They went straight to the cargo hold access. We could hear them working below us, voices muffled through their breathing apparatus, equipment being moved. The passengers sat in terrified silence. A little girl in row 18 asked her father if we were safe. He told her yes, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. After what felt like an eternity, one of the hazmat team members came into the cabin. He didn't remove his helmet. He spoke through a voice modulator that made him sound robotic. The cargo hold is secure. You'll be moved to a secure location for observation. They wouldn't let us see what they removed from the cargo hold. They made us deplane through the forward door while they worked at the rear of the aircraft. But as I walked down the stairs to the tarmac, I glanced back. I saw them carrying something out. A large container, heavily damaged. The door was torn open from the inside. Whatever had been in there was gone. The container had warning labels I couldn't read from that distance. But I saw the biohazard symbol. I saw the CDC seal. And I saw the restraints inside. Heavy metal restraints meant to hold something down, now shredded like tissue paper. They quarantined all of us, passengers and crew, for 14 hours in a secure facility at the airport. Military personnel, not TSA, not regular airport security. They asked us questions, made us sign documents. Non-disclosure agreements with language so serious it mentioned federal prosecution. They examined the aircraft. I later heard they grounded it permanently, but I don't know if that's true. The airline scrubbed every record of the incident. Our flight logs were altered. Officially, we diverted due to mechanical issues. Nothing about cargo, nothing about what we heard and saw. Before they released us, a man in a suit who never gave his name pulled me aside. What you experienced was a malfunction of the cargo refrigeration unit, he said, his voice flat and rehearsive. The sounds were hydraulic pressure escaping. The temperature drop was a climate control failure. Do you understand? I understood what he was really saying. I nodded. He handed me a card with a phone number. If you experience any symptoms, any health issues, call this number immediately. Don't go to a regular doctor. Then he walked away. I never called that number. I never had symptoms, whatever that meant. But I did research. I spent months trying to find information about what could have been in that container. Medical specimen headed to the CDC. Biological transport that shouldn't have been alive. I found nothing conclusive. Just hints and fragments. References to classified research programs, archived news articles about unknown pathogens, conspiracy theories I wanted to dismiss but couldn't entirely ignore. What haunts me most isn't the crying or the scraping or even the damaged container with the shredded restraints. It's what I found 3 months later. I was walking through Hartsfield-Jackson, heading to my gate for a shift, when I passed the cargo handling area. A container was being loaded, similar size and shape to the one from that night. I saw the labels, CDC seal, biohazard warnings, and in small print, something I'd never noticed before. A number, protocol classification. I wrote it down and searched it later. The results were scrubbed from every database I could access, but I found one cached page before it disappeared. A research program designation, specimen containment and transport. And a note. In case of containment breach, Protocol Omega authorization required. I still fly. I still work those long-haul routes out of Atlanta. But every time I'm in that rear galley, every time I hear the cargo being loaded below, I remember that sound. That crying that shouldn't have existed. That scraping of something trying to claw its way up to where we were. And I wonder how many other flights carry cargo we don't know about. How many sealed containers are down there right now in holds beneath our feet, holding things that shouldn't be alive, things that sometimes wake up, things that sometimes get free. My name is Colin, and I've been a flight attendant for 13 years. October 1997 was a different time in aviation. We didn't have the security measures we have today, didn't have the technology, didn't have the same level of scrutiny on passengers. It was easier to disappear back then. Easier to hide things, easier to get away with the unthinkable. I learned that lesson on a late-night flight out of O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. And it's a lesson that still wakes me up in cold sweats 27 years later. Some confessions you hear while trapped in an aircraft aren't meant for forgiveness. Some are meant as trophies, proof of what someone got away with. And the worst part is knowing you might be the only person who can stop them before they do it again. It was a Thursday night, and the 11:45 p.m. departure to San Francisco was running on time. The aircraft was a 757, and we had maybe 90 passengers, light load for that route. Most people were already half asleep during boarding. Businessmen loosening their ties, a few college students with headphones on. The usual mix of red-eye travelers who just wanted to get across the country and grab a few hours of sleep. I was working first class that night with Nasir handling the main cabin. He was a good guy, been flying for about 5 years, always professional and calm. We'd worked together enough times that we didn't need to talk much during service, just had that easy flow of knowing what needed to be done. The man in seat 2A caught my attention during boarding because he didn't fit the usual first-class passenger profile. He was maybe 35, wearing an expensive suit, but something about him seemed off. His tie was loosened, but not in a relaxed way. More like he'd been pulling at it. His hands were clean, but I noticed his fingernails were bitten down to the quick. He had this intensity in his eyes, like he was running on adrenaline and caffeine. When I greeted him, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He ordered a scotch before we even pushed back from the gate, and I brought it to him during the pre-departure beverage service. We took off into the darkness, the lights of Chicago spreading out below us before disappearing into clouds. I started the dinner service about 30 minutes into the flight. Most of first class was already declining meals, wanting to sleep. But the man in 2A ordered the chicken and another scotch. He was the only passenger still awake in the entire first-class cabin. The rest had reclined their seats, pulled blankets over themselves, put on eye masks. The cabin was dark except for his reading light and the glow from the galley where I was preparing his meal. When I brought his dinner, he thanked me and then said something that seemed casual at the time. "Long night for you, I bet." "Me too. Just finished up some business in Chicago. Leaving a problem behind, you could say." I smiled politely, the way we're trained to acknowledge passengers without really engaging. "Hope you can get some rest on the flight," I said. He took a sip of his scotch and looked at me with those intense eyes. "I don't think I'll sleep tonight. Too much on my mind." You ever have one of those nights where you do something you can't take back? I should have walked away then. Should have just nodded and returned to the galley. But something in his voice made me pause. It wasn't regret I heard. It was something else. Excitement, maybe. Or pride. "I'm sure tomorrow will be better," I said, trying to end the conversation. He laughed, a quiet sound that had no humor in it. "Tomorrow I'll be in San Francisco starting fresh. No one there knows what I did tonight. Clean slate." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I excused myself and went back to the galley. Nasir came up from the main cabin about 20 minutes later to grab some coffee. "How's first class?" he asked. I glanced toward 2A. The man was eating his dinner, staring out the window at the darkness. "There's something off about the guy in 2A, I said quietly. "He keeps making weird comments about leaving problems behind in Chicago." Nasir shrugged. "Probably just drunk business guy. You know how they get on these late flights." He was right. I'd seen plenty of passengers get chatty after a few drinks, saying things they wouldn't normally say. But this felt different. An hour later, I was doing a cabin check when the man in 2A called me over. He'd finished his meal and was on his third scotch. The reading light cast shadows on his face, that made him look almost skeletal. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "It's eating at me, keeping it all inside." Every instinct told me to decline politely, but I was stuck. We were in the middle of a flight, nowhere to go, and he was a first-class passenger who seemed like he needed to talk. "Sure," I said, against my better judgment. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. "I killed someone tonight, about 4 hours ago, in her apartment in Wicker Park." The words came out so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. I felt my blood turn cold. My hands gripped the seat back in front of me. "Sir, that's not funny," I managed to say. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. "I'm not joking. She was 28, blonde hair, green eyes. She worked at an art gallery on North Avenue. We'd been seeing each other for 3 months. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He was either completely insane or telling the truth, and neither option was good. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and it was the most chilling thing I had ever seen. "Because you can't do anything about it up here. We're in the air. By the time we land, I'll have a lawyer. And honestly, it feels good to tell someone, to say it out loud. I planned it perfectly." He started describing it. Details I didn't want to hear, but couldn't stop listening to. He told me about her apartment, the layout, the color of her couch. He described what she was wearing when he arrived. He told me how he'd brought wine, her favorite kind, and how she'd trusted him completely. Then he described what he did, the method, the timeline, how long it took, where he left her. Every word was delivered in that same calm, casual tone, like he was recounting a movie he'd watched. I felt sick. The recycled cabin air suddenly seemed too thick to breathe. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. "I need to inform the captain," I said, starting to back away. He shook his head. "Go ahead. I'll just deny everything. Say I was drunk and making up stories. There's no evidence on me. I was very careful. I showered at a gym before coming to the airport. Changed clothes. Everything I wore tonight is in a dumpster in 3 different locations." I went straight to Nasir and pulled him into the galley. My hands were shaking as I told him what the passenger had said. Nasir's face went pale. "He actually confessed to murder?" I nodded. He gave me details, specific details. The victim's apartment, her job, everything. Nasir grabbed the phone that connected to the cockpit. "We need to tell the captain. They can have police meet us when we land." The captain listened to our report and said he'd contact authorities in San Francisco. He asked if the passengers seemed dangerous or threatening. I looked toward 2A. The man had reclined his seat and appeared to be sleeping peacefully, a slight smile on his face. "He's calm," I said. "Too calm." The captain told us to keep an eye on him, but not to engage further. The rest of the flight felt endless. Every minute dragged by. I kept watching 2A, expecting him to do something, but he just slept. About an hour before landing, he woke up and called me over again. "I know you told them," he said pleasantly. "I saw you on the phone. It's okay. I expected it." He pulled out his cell phone, one of those early flip phones that were just becoming common. "Want to see proof?" He showed me a photo on the tiny screen. It was dark and grainy, but I could make out what looked like a crime scene. There was blood, a lot of blood, and what might have been a person, though the image was too unclear to be certain. The timestamp showed it was from earlier that evening. I stepped back, my stomach churning. He put the phone away. "Don't worry. That photo will be deleted before we land. no evidence, and my story will be simple. I was drunk, telling tall tales to pass the time on a boring flight. I'll seem embarrassed and apologetic. My lawyer is very good. He's dealt with worse. The casual confidence in his voice was terrifying. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a drunken confession. This was a game to him. We landed at San Francisco International just after 2 a.m. Police were waiting at the gate, just as the captain had arranged. I watched as they boarded and approached 2A. He seemed genuinely surprised, played the role perfectly. "Officers, what's this about?" he asked, confused and concerned. They asked him to come with them. He cooperated completely, looking back at me with an expression of hurt betrayal, like I'd wronged him somehow. I gave my statement to the police, told them everything he'd said, every detail. They took notes, asked questions, seemed to take it seriously. They told me they'd contact Chicago police immediately to check the address he'd mentioned. Nasir gave his statement too, confirming that I'd reported the conversation to him during the flight. Then we were released. We went to our hotel. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that photo on his phone, kept hearing his voice describing what he'd done. The next morning, I called the police department to follow up. They told me Chicago police had indeed found a woman dead in an apartment in Wicker Park. She was 28. The details matched his confession almost perfectly. But here's where it gets worse. The passenger had a lawyer waiting at the police station. An expensive lawyer who immediately claimed his client had been drinking heavily on the flight and had fabricated the entire story. The passenger insisted he'd made it all up, that he'd read about a similar case in the newspaper and embellished it to disturb me because he was drunk and thought it was funny. The photo on his phone? Deleted, just as he'd promised. The clothes he'd worn? Never found. His alibi was airtight for the time of death. He claimed he'd been at a business dinner with multiple witnesses until 10 p.m., then went straight to the airport. The witnesses confirmed it. The timeline was tight but possible if she'd been killed earlier than estimated. And there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. Nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses seeing him at her apartment. I testified when the case went to trial 8 months later. I told the jury exactly what he'd told me on that flight. But his lawyer tore my testimony apart. He suggested I'd misunderstood, that his client had been intoxicated and rambling, that the details I remembered might have been influenced by news reports I'd read later. He painted me as a flight attendant looking for attention, maybe even someone who wanted to be a hero. The passenger took the stand and apologized tearfully, said he'd been going through a difficult divorce, had been drinking, and had made up a terrible story to cope with his own problems. He seemed genuinely remorseful. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They came back with not guilty, reasonable doubt, without physical evidence, without the photo, with his alibi witnesses and his lawyer's arguments. They couldn't convict. I watched him walk out of that courtroom a free man. He looked at me as he left, just for a second, and he smiled. That same cold smile from the airplane. He knew I knew, and he knew there was nothing I could do about it. I still fly, still work red-eyes sometimes, though I avoid the Chicago to San Francisco route when I can. I see his face sometimes in other passengers. That same intensity, that same cold calculation. I've learned that some people confess not because they want forgiveness or because guilt is eating at them. Some people confess because it's part of the thrill. Because telling someone what they did and getting away with it anyway makes the victory even sweeter. The victim's case is officially unsolved. Her family never got justice. And somewhere out there, he's living his life, Maybe sitting in first class on another red-eye, maybe telling another flight attendant another story. And I wonder how many others there have been. How many other confessions on other flights that were dismissed as drunk talk or attention-seeking lies? How many people have sat in seat 2A or 12C or 7F and casually mentioned leaving problems behind, knowing that by the time anyone could verify their story, they'd already have their alibi ready, their lawyer on speed dial, their evidence destroyed? The worst part is the helplessness. Being up there with someone who just admitted to murder, knowing you can't do anything but report it and hope someone takes it seriously. Being trapped in an aircraft with evil wearing an expensive suit and drinking scotch. And knowing that sometimes, even when you do everything right, even when you report it and testify and try to get justice, the system fails. Evil walks free. And all you're left with is the memory of that confession, playing over and over in your mind. A secret you'll carry forever that no one else fully believes. Have you ever had someone confess something terrible to you, and you were powerless to do anything about it? Let me know in the comments below. My name is Hezekiah, and I've been a flight attendant for 12 years. February 2021 was when I experienced something that still makes me question my own sanity. I was based out of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, working domestic routes that usually felt routine and predictable. But what happened on a short afternoon flight that month changed everything I thought I understood about time, reality, and what can happen when you're flying over empty desert landscape. I have scars on my body that I can't explain. I have memories that don't match the official record. And I know that something happened during those missing hours, something that everyone else has forgotten or chosen to ignore. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the flight was scheduled to depart at 2:30 p.m., heading to Seattle. It was supposed to be a quick 2-hour flight, nothing complicated, just a simple hop up the West Coast. The aircraft was a smaller regional jet, and we had about 80 passengers on board. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies stretching in every direction, not a cloud visible anywhere. I was working with Ryden, another flight attendant who'd been flying for about 7 years. We'd worked together before, had a good professional relationship, never had any issues with communication or coordination. The pre-flight briefing was completely standard. The captain mentioned the flight time, the route we'd be taking, said we might see some light chop over northern Arizona, but nothing significant. Passengers boarded efficiently, everyone seemed relaxed and ready for an easy flight. I remember helping an elderly couple stow their carry-on bags, and a businessman who asked for coffee before we even pushed back from the gate. Everything felt normal. Everything felt like the hundreds of other flights I'd worked before. We took off right on time at 2:30 p.m. I checked my watch as we lifted off, a habit I'd developed over the years. The Phoenix skyline fell away beneath us, and soon we were over the desert, that endless expanse of brown and red earth stretching to the horizon. The seatbelt sign turned off about 15 minutes into the flight, and Ryden and I started the beverage service. I pushed the cart down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks, making small talk with passengers. A woman in row 8 asked for tomato juice. A teenager in row 14 wanted a Coke. Normal requests, normal interactions, everything completely routine. I was about halfway through the cabin when I felt something strange. It's hard to describe exactly what it was. The air pressure seemed to shift, like my ears needed to pop, but couldn't. The quality of light coming through the windows changed, becoming slightly dimmer, slightly more orange. I paused, looking around the cabin. Ryden was at the front, pouring coffee for someone. Passengers were reading, sleeping, scrolling through their phones. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. Then I blinked, and suddenly I was at the front of the cabin near the galley. The beverage cart was gone. I had no memory of finishing the service or moving from where I'd been. I looked at my watch. It read 8:47 p.m. That couldn't be right. I just checked it minutes ago and it had been 2:50 p.m. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. That disorienting feeling when you wake up and don't know where you are. But I wasn't asleep. I was standing in the galley, fully awake, and 6 hours had somehow vanished. I looked out the window. It was dark outside. Completely dark. The sun had been shining when I was doing beverage service. Now it was night. I could see lights below, city lights that meant we were approaching somewhere. The intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. We'll be on the ground in Seattle in about 10 minutes. Seattle. We were arriving, but that made no sense. The flight was only supposed to take 2 hours. It should have been around 4:30 p.m. Pacific time when we landed, still daylight. Why was it dark? Why did my watch say 8:47 p.m.? I stumbled forward, my legs feeling weak and strange. I found Ryden securing the galley cart, getting ready for landing. "Ryden," I said, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. "What time is it?" He looked at me with a slightly confused expression. "Almost 9. Why?" I grabbed his arm, probably harder than I should have. "What happened? Where did the time go? We took off at 2:30. It should be around 4:30 now, not 9. He pulled his arm back, looking at me with concern. "Hezekiah, are you feeling okay? It's been a normal flight. We've been in the air for the right amount of time." I checked the cabin. Passengers were putting away their laptops, stowing their tray tables, preparing for arrival. They all looked normal, relaxed, like they'd just had a routine flight. But something was wrong with them too, I realized. The woman in row 8 who'd asked for tomato juice had a nosebleed. Dried blood crusted under her nose. The businessman who'd wanted coffee had a bruise on his forehead that definitely hadn't been there during boarding. The teenager in row 14 was missing a fingernail on his right hand, the finger wrapped in a napkin with fresh blood seeping through. I moved through the cabin during the landing prep, looking more carefully at the passengers. Almost all of them had some kind of injury. Bruises on their arms, scratches on their faces. One man had what looked like a burn mark on the back of his hand. A woman near the rear had a torn sleeve on her blouse, the fabric ripped like something had grabbed her. But nobody seemed to notice. Nobody seemed concerned. They were all acting like everything was perfectly normal. We landed in Seattle. I felt the wheels touch down, felt the engines reverse, felt the familiar deceleration. My watch still said 8:47 p.m. I looked at my phone. It showed the same time. The date was correct, February 18th, 2021. But 6 hours were missing. 6 hours that I couldn't remember. 6 hours that apparently nobody else could remember either. The captain came on the intercom and thanked everyone for flying with us, apologized for nothing because, from his perspective, nothing had gone wrong. Passengers deplaned normally. I stood at the door saying goodbye, watching them file past. That's when I noticed my own hands. There were scratches on my knuckles that hadn't been there before. 3 parallel marks, like I'd scraped them against something rough. My uniform sleeve was torn slightly at the shoulder, a small rip I definitely would have noticed earlier. And when I touched my face, I felt a tender spot on my jaw, painful when I pressed it, like I'd been hit or had fallen against something hard. Ryden and I walked off the plane together. I tried to talk to him about what I was noticing, the injuries, the missing time, the impossibility of it all. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "We had a normal flight, Hezekiah. 2 hours, just like scheduled. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone and showed him the time. Look, it's almost 9 p.m. We took off at 2:30 Phoenix time. Even with the time zone change, it should only be around 4:30 here. Where did 4 extra hours go? He looked at my phone, then at his own. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, but it disappeared almost immediately. The time is right. We must have had a delay, I'm not remembering. Maybe we circled for a while. I don't know. I'm tired. I just want to get to the hotel. He walked away, leaving me standing in the jetway, trying to make sense of what was happening. I went to find the captain, but he'd already left the aircraft. The gate agents were processing the next flight. Everything was moving forward like nothing unusual had occurred. I got to the hotel and immediately went to my room. I stripped off my uniform and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The scratches on my hands were definitely real. The bruise on my jaw was darkening, turning purple. But there were other marks too. On my left shoulder blade, there was what looked like a handprint. 5 distinct finger-shaped bruises, like someone had grabbed me hard enough to leave marks through my clothes. On my right forearm, there was a series of small puncture marks, almost like injection sites, but I had no memory of anyone injecting me with anything. I tried to reconstruct the flight in my memory. I remembered boarding, remembered takeoff, remembered starting the beverage service. Then there was this gap, this absolute void where memories should be. And then I was suddenly at the front of the cabin, and it was night. In between those 2 moments, there was nothing. Just darkness, just absence. But my body told a different story. My body said that something had happened during those missing hours, something physical and violent enough to leave marks. I called the airline's operations center and asked them to send me the flight data. They emailed it to me within an hour. According to the official record, the flight had departed Phoenix at 2:30 p.m. and arrived in Seattle at 4:32 p.m. local time. Total flight time, 2 hours and 2 minutes. Completely normal. But my watch said it was 9:15 p.m. My phone said the same thing. Every clock in my hotel room confirmed it. So either the flight data was wrong, or somehow 4 extra hours had happened that weren't recorded anywhere. I checked social media looking for any posts from passengers on that flight. I found a few. A woman had posted a selfie with the caption, "Quick flight to Seattle." The timestamp on the post was 9:03 p.m. Not 4:30 p.m., 9:03 p.m. So she experienced the same time as me, but she didn't seem to think it was strange. I found another post from a businessman who'd been in first class. He'd checked in at a Seattle restaurant at 9:30 p.m., complaining about being hungry after a long day of travel. Long day, not quick 2-hour flight. Over the next few days, I became slightly obsessed with figuring out what had happened. I tried to contact other passengers from that flight, but most didn't respond to my messages. The few who did thought I was crazy. One woman told me the flight had been perfectly normal and suggested I see a doctor. A man told me to stop harassing him or he'd report me to the airline. Nobody else seemed to have any memory of the missing time, or if they did, they weren't willing to talk about it. I requested the flight data recorder information through official channels, claiming I needed it for an incident report. The airline refused, said there was no incident to report, and suggested I take some time off if I was feeling stressed. I went to a doctor and got examined. The scratches, the bruises, the puncture marks were all documented. The doctor asked how I'd gotten them. I told him I didn't know. He ordered some blood tests. Everything came back normal, except for one thing. My white blood cell count was elevated, like my body had been fighting off an infection or had experienced significant stress. I still fly, though I requested a transfer away from that particular route. I avoid Phoenix to Seattle now, avoid flights that cross over long stretches of empty desert. But the questions haunt me. What happened during those 4 missing hours? Where did we go? What did we experience that our minds have blocked out or been made to forget? And why do I have physical evidence of trauma that nobody else seems to acknowledge? Sometimes I dream about it. Fragmented images that don't quite make sense. White walls that curve in impossible ways. Lights that are too bright in the wrong color. Voices speaking in tones I can't quite process. And faces, lots of faces, all the passengers from that flight, all of us together in a space that wasn't the airplane. All of us experiencing something we weren't supposed to remember. Then I wake up, and the dreams fade, leaving only the certainty that something happened, something real and terrifying that I'll never fully understand. The scars are still there. I can see them every day when I change clothes. Physical proof that the missing hours weren't just a glitch in my memory or a malfunction of my watch. Something happened to all of us on that flight, and whatever it was, it left marks that no amount of denial can erase. Have you ever lost time and couldn't account for where it went? Share your experience in the comments below. My name is Moshe, and I've been a flight attendant for 14 years. December 2010 is a month that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was based out of Dallas, Fort Worth International Airport, working holiday routes during what should have been a joyful season. Christmas was approaching, and most flights were filled with families heading home for the holidays, people excited about reunions and celebrations. But what happened on a routine evening flight that month taught me that some things wearing human faces aren't human at all. And sometimes evil doesn't announce itself with thunder and darkness. Sometimes it announces itself with a smile that never stops growing. It was December 18th, a Friday evening, and the flight was scheduled to depart at 6:15 p.m. heading to Boston. The aircraft was completely full, every seat booked with holiday travelers. The pre-flight briefing was standard. The captain mentioned some weather systems we'd be skirting around. Nothing serious, maybe a few bumps, but overall a smooth flight. I was working the main cabin with Francis, a flight attendant who'd been with the airline for about 9 years. We'd flown together many times before, had a good working relationship built on mutual respect and efficiency. Boarding was chaotic in the way holiday flights always are. Families struggling with too much luggage, children excited and restless, everyone trying to squeeze oversized bags into overhead bins. I helped a mother with 3 small kids get settled, helped an elderly man find space for his coat, answered the same questions about seat assignments and lavatory locations that I answered on every flight. About halfway through boarding, a woman came down the aisle and took her seat in 14B, the middle seat in row 14. She was probably in her late 40s, average height, wearing a dark blue cardigan and gray slacks. Brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had a pleasant face, the kind that blends into a crowd, utterly unremarkable. She smiled at the passengers on either side of her as she sat down, a polite, closed-mouth smile. She placed a small purse under the seat in front of her and buckled her seatbelt. Nothing about her stood out. Nothing suggested that within the next 2 hours, she would become the center of the most terrifying experience of my career. We finished boarding and completed all the pre-flight safety checks. I went through the safety demonstration while Francis checked that everyone had their seatbelts fastened and their seats upright. The woman in 14B watched the safety demonstration with that same pleasant smile. We pushed back from the gate right on time. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and we taxied toward the runway. The cabin lights were still bright, and I could see passengers settling in, most of them already focused on books or phones or conversations with their seatmates. We took off into a cold December evening. The lights of Dallas spread out below us, twinkling in the growing darkness. The seatbelt sign turned off about 20 minutes into the flight, and Francis and I started preparing for the beverage service. That's when I first noticed something odd about the woman in 14B. I was walking through the cabin doing a quick check, and I glanced at her as I passed. She was still smiling. The exact same smile she'd had when she boarded. It hadn't changed, hadn't shifted. She was staring straight ahead at the seat back in front of her. And that smile was frozen on her face, like it had been painted there. I continued my walk through the cabin, pushed the odd observation out of my mind. People smile for all kinds of reasons. Maybe she was happy about going to Boston. Maybe she was thinking about something pleasant. Maybe she just had one of those faces that naturally settles into a smile. I got the beverage cart ready and started the service from the front of the cabin, working my way back. Francis was doing the same from the rear, and we'd meet in the middle like we always did. About 45 minutes into the flight, I was serving row 12 when the passenger in 12C, a businessman in his 50s, leaned toward me and spoke quietly. "Is that woman in 14B okay? She hasn't moved or blinked in like 20 minutes. It's kind of freaking me out." I looked past him to row 14. The woman was still sitting in the exact same position, staring straight ahead, smiling. From where I stood, I could see her face in profile. Her eyes were open wide, unblinking. And her smile had changed. It was wider now. Noticeably wider. The corners of her mouth were stretched further than they'd been before, pulling her lips back to show her teeth. I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warm cabin air. I finished serving row 12 and moved to row 13, getting closer to her. The passenger in the window seat next to her, a young woman maybe in her early 20s, was pressed against the window, as far from 14B as she could get. She looked terrified. When I reached their row, I asked if anyone needed anything. The young woman shook her head quickly, not taking her eyes off the woman in the middle seat. The passenger in the aisle seat, an older man, had moved slightly into the aisle, also creating distance. The woman in 14B didn't respond to my question, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. She just sat there, staring, smiling that impossibly wide smile. I leaned down slightly, trying to make eye contact. "Ma'am, can I get you anything to drink?" Nothing. No response. No movement except for the steady rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Her eyes were completely fixed on the seat back in front of her. And her smile kept growing. I could see it happening in real time now, her mouth stretching wider, the skin around her lips pulled taut, her teeth fully exposed in a grin that was far beyond anything anatomically normal. I backed away and found Francis near the rear galley. "Something's wrong with the passenger in 14B, told him quietly. "She's not responding, and she's smiling in this really disturbing way." He nodded. "I noticed her too. Several passengers have mentioned her to me. Should we try to wake her up? Maybe she's sleeping with her eyes open." We both knew that wasn't what was happening, but we had to do something. We approached row 14 together. Francis knelt in the aisle next to her seat. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" He reached out slowly and touched her shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, she turned her head toward him. The movement was wrong. Too smooth, too fluid. Like her neck was on a swivel with no bones or muscles involved. Her smile was enormous now, stretching literally from ear to ear, so wide that it looked like her face might split apart. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils. The entire eye, from corner to corner, was a solid, lightless black. Francis jerked his hand back and stumbled into the aisle. Other passengers were starting to notice now, starting to stare, starting to realize something was very wrong. The woman's head slowly rotated back to face forward, that mechanical smoothness making my stomach turn. Then she started speaking. But it wasn't one voice. It was multiple voices, all speaking at once, layered over each other in different pitches and tones. Some were high and childlike. Some were deep and masculine. Some were old and raspy. They all came out of her mouth simultaneously, creating this horrible, discordant sound that made my teeth ache. The words were in different languages, most of which I didn't recognize. But mixed in with the foreign syllables, I heard English. She was saying names. My name. Moshe has been faithful, but Moshe will fail. Francis's name. Francis knows the truth. Francis hides the truth. Then other names. Passengers on the plane. The woman in row 9 buried her daughter. The man in row 3 killed someone in 1987. The woman in row 21 will die in 3 months. The voices kept speaking, kept revealing things, kept saying impossible secrets in that awful, overlapping chorus. Passengers started panicking. Some unbuckled and stood up, pressing into the aisles, trying to get away from her. Parents covered their children's ears. A woman in row 15 started crying. A man in row 13 was shouting, demanding to know what was happening. The cabin erupted into chaos. Francis ran to the cockpit to alert the captain. I tried to maintain some kind of order, tried to calm people down, but I couldn't take my eyes off the woman in 14B. She was still smiling, that grotesque, impossible smile. And then she said something that made my blood freeze. She spoke my grandmother's name, my grandmother who had died 6 years earlier. And she repeated, in my grandmother's exact voice, isolated now from the chorus, the last words my grandmother had said to me before she passed away. Words that nobody else had heard, words I'd never told anyone. The woman in 14B couldn't possibly know those words, but she spoke them perfectly, in a voice I recognized with every fiber of my being. The plane hit turbulence. Violent, sudden turbulence that seemed to center around row 14. The aircraft bucked and shook, but only in that section. The overhead bins above row 14 flew open, contents spilling out. The reading lights in that area flickered and sparked. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. Frost formed on the windows near her seat. Passengers were screaming now, complete panic filling the cabin. I grabbed the intercom and tried to speak over the noise, tried to tell everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts, but my voice was drowned out by the chaos. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The turbulence ceased, the temperature normalized, the lights stopped flickering, and the woman in 14B closed her mouth. Her smile disappeared. Her eyes, when they cleared, were normal brown eyes again, confused and frightened. She looked around at the panicked passengers, at the mess in the aisles, at Francis and me staring at her. "What happened?" she asked in a perfectly normal voice, a single voice, her own voice. "Why is everyone looking at me?" The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained and uncertain. "Flight attendants, please restore order to the cabin. We'll be landing as soon as possible." We diverted to the nearest airport, which happened to be in Little Rock, Arkansas. Emergency medical personnel met us at the gate. The woman in 14B was taken off the plane first, looking bewildered and scared. She had no memory of what had happened. No memory of the smiling, the voices, any of it. The medical team examined her and found nothing physically wrong. The other passengers were interviewed. Most were too shaken to make coherent statements. The few who tried to explain what they'd seen were dismissed as experiencing mass hysteria or panic. The official report from the airline listed the incident as severe turbulence combined with a medical emergency involving an unresponsive passenger. They made us all sign incident reports that carefully avoided mentioning the specific details of what we'd witnessed. But I kept investigating. I couldn't let it go. I found the passenger manifest and learned the woman's identity. I tracked down her information and discovered something that made my hands shake when I read it. She'd been on another flight 6 months earlier, different airline, different route. That flight had also diverted due to an unexplained incident involving her. Before that, there was another incident 2 years prior. A pattern. Every few months or years, she'd fly somewhere, and something would happen. Something that got explained away, covered up, forgotten. I found her passport photo in a news article about one of the previous incidents. In the photo, she was smiling. That same too-wide smile that I'd seen growing on her face during the flight. The photo was dated from 5 years ago, but the smile was already wrong, already stretched beyond natural limits. Whatever was inside her, it had been there for a long time. And it liked to fly. It liked to be trapped in a metal tube with hundreds of people who couldn't escape. It liked to smile. The woman herself disappeared after our flight. I tried to contact her, tried to find her, but it was like she'd vanished. No address, no phone number, no records. The airline claimed they had no further information. I sometimes wonder if she's still out there. Still flying, still sitting in middle seats on crowded flights, wearing that pleasant, unremarkable face. Still smiling. I still work holiday flights. I still see families reuniting, children excited about travel, all the joy that comes with this season. But I also watch the passengers more carefully now. I look for the ones who smile too long, the ones whose eyes don't quite match their expressions, the ones who might be wearing human skin like a costume, hiding something ancient and hungry underneath. Because I learned that some passengers aren't passengers at all. They're just visiting. And they always, always smile. What would you do if the person sitting next to you on a flight smiled for hours without stopping? My name is Finnegan, and I've been a flight attendant for 17 years. August 1994 was before most of the technology we take for granted today existed. We didn't have smartphones or internet access or even email in the way we have it now. Things happened differently back then. And when something strange occurred, there was no immediate way to verify information or look up histories. I was based out of Boston Logan International Airport, working routes up and down the East Coast. What happened to me on a grounded aircraft during an overnight stay taught me that some places hold on to their tragedies, and some machines remember every terrible thing that's happened inside them. It was a Tuesday night in mid-August, humid and warm even after the sun had gone down. I was scheduled to work a late afternoon flight from Boston to Miami, with the return flight the next morning. But when we landed back in Boston around 9 p.m., the aircraft developed mechanical issues. The captain reported problems with one of the hydraulic systems. Nothing immediately dangerous, but serious enough that the plane needed to be grounded overnight for inspection and repairs. The passengers deplaned normally, collecting their bags and heading home, unaware of the issue. The airline made a decision that seemed routine at the time. Rather than move all the supplies and equipment off the aircraft and then reload everything in the morning, they asked if any crew members would be willing to stay overnight in the plane and do the preparation work for the morning flight. The pay was good, time and a half for overnight work, and I volunteered. I'd done similar things before. Staying late to restock galleys or complete paperwork. Spending a night in a grounded plane didn't seem like a big deal. It was just an aircraft, a machine, nothing more. The maintenance crew was working in a different section of the airport, so it was just me and the plane. The aircraft was a 727, an older model that the airline was planning to phase out over the next year or two. It had been in service since the early 1980s, had flown thousands of routes, carried hundreds of thousands of passengers. The interior was worn, the seats showing years of use, the carpet faded and stained despite regular cleaning. There was that particular smell that older aircraft have, a mixture of recycled air, cleaning chemicals, jet fuel, and something else I could never quite identify. I boarded the empty plane around 11:00 p.m. The jetway was still connected, and the aircraft was receiving ground power, so the lights worked and the air conditioning ran. I had my checklist of tasks to complete. Restock the galley, replace the safety cards in the seat pockets, check all the overhead bins, do a thorough cleaning of the lavatories, and prep everything so the morning crew could board and go. I estimated it would take me 4 or 5 hours, which meant I'd be done around 3 or 4 a.m., plenty of time to get a few hours of sleep before the morning flight. The cabin lights were on when I started, that bright fluorescent glow that makes everything look harsh and clinical. I began at the front of the plane, working my way back row by row. I replaced safety cards, picked up trash that passengers had left behind, straightened seat cushions. The work was mindless, repetitive, and I let my mind wander as I moved through the empty cabin. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps. Clear, distinct footsteps coming from somewhere behind me in the aircraft. I stopped and turned around. The cabin stretched out behind me, empty rows of seats, dim lighting toward the rear. Nothing moved. Nobody was there. I called out, "Hello? Maintenance crew?" No response. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the aircraft settling on its landing gear. I shrugged it off. Old planes made noise, metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Perfectly normal. I went back to work. 20 minutes later, I heard it again. Footsteps in the aisle behind me, the distinctive sound of shoes on that thin aircraft carpet. This time they were closer. I spun around quickly, expecting to catch whoever was walking, but again, there was nothing. The aisle was empty. My heart rate picked up slightly. The rational part of my brain said it was just the plane making noise, but it sounded so much like footsteps, so deliberate, so rhythmic. I decided to work faster. I was in the middle of the cabin, around row 15, when the overhead bins started opening. Not all at once, one at a time. The bin above row 8 popped open with a soft click. Then the one above row 12. Then row 20. I watched, frozen, as bin after bin opened down the length of the cabin, each one making that same mechanical click as the latch released. My mouth went dry. There was no wind, no turbulence, no reason for those bins to open. I checked them myself. They'd been securely closed. I grabbed the bins and slammed them shut, one after another, my hands shaking. The moment I closed the last one, I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. A ding, the passenger call button. Row 23. I stared at the illuminated light above the seat. Someone had pressed the call button, but there was nobody in row 23. Nobody in the entire aircraft except me. I stood there, unable to move, watching that little light glow in the empty cabin. Then another ding. Row 9, then row 17, then row 4. Call buttons lighting up randomly throughout the cabin, that familiar chiming sound echoing in the empty space. I felt panic rising in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the plane settling or making mechanical noises. Something was happening. Something was wrong. I moved toward the front of the aircraft, thinking I should leave, should get off the plane and tell someone. But as I passed row 6, I saw something that stopped me cold. A shadow, sitting in seat 6C. It wasn't a person exactly. It was darker than the surrounding space, a human-shaped void in the air. I could see the seat back through it, but distorted like looking through dark water. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, but I could feel it watching me. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off it. My back hit the galley cart and I nearly screamed. When I looked at row 6 again, the shadow was gone. I ran to the cockpit door and tried the handle. Locked. The flight deck was secured for the night and I didn't have access. I was trapped in the main cabin with whatever was happening. I pulled out my phone, an old flip phone that barely worked, thinking I'd call someone, but there was no signal inside the aircraft. I was alone, completely alone, or maybe not alone at all. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath suddenly, white clouds in the air conditioning. The cabin went from comfortable to freezing in less than a minute. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering. Then I heard voices. Multiple voices, talking all at once, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They were muffled, like they were behind a wall or underwater. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence of conversation, of people talking to each other. I moved toward the rear of the aircraft, driven by some instinct I didn't understand. The voices grew louder as I approached the back rows. I could almost make out words now. Someone was crying. Someone else was praying. Someone was screaming. The sounds overlapped, creating this awful chorus of fear and pain. And then I saw them. Shadow figures sitting in the rear seats. Dozens of them. Some sitting normally, some bent over like they were in crash positions, some reaching toward the windows. I stumbled backward, and my hand hit a seat pocket. I felt paper and pulled it out. An old newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. The date was June 1982. The headline made my blood freeze. The article described a crash. This exact aircraft. This registration number. 12 years earlier, the plane had been involved in a serious incident. Not a full crash, but a catastrophic landing where the aircraft had skidded off the runway. 15 passengers had died. The airline had repaired the plane, put it back into service, but the article mentioned that crew members on subsequent flights had reported strange occurrences. Unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions, passengers complaining about cold spots and feelings of being watched. The shadow figures in the rear seats were still there, and now I understood what I was seeing. The passengers from that crash, still here, still trapped somehow in the aircraft that had killed them. I looked at the clipping again and saw a list of names. The victims, 15 names. I didn't recognize any of them, but seeing them written out made it real in a way that terrified me more than anything else. The oxygen masks dropped, every single one from every seat, dropping down with that sharp pop and the rubber tube swinging. The emergency lighting kicked on, bathing everything in that eerie red glow. The voices were screaming now, all of them screaming at once, and I couldn't tell if they were warning me or threatening me or just replaying their final moments over and over in this metal tomb. I ran. I didn't care about the job or the checklist or anything except getting off that aircraft. I sprinted down the aisle, past the shadow figures, past the swinging oxygen masks, past everything. I reached the forward door and grabbed the handle, yanking it open. The emergency slide deployed automatically with a loud hiss, inflating into the jetway. I jumped onto it and slid down, hitting the ground hard and rolling. I lay there on the tarmac, gasping for breath, staring up at the plane. Through the windows, I could see lights flickering inside. The shadow figures were visible through the glass, dozens of them, filling the cabin. And then, slowly, the lights went out. The shadows disappeared. Everything went still. By the time security arrived, responding to the deployed emergency slide, the aircraft looked completely normal. I told them I'd had a panic attack, that I'd gotten claustrophobic being alone in the plane. They were skeptical, but accepted the explanation. I filed an incident report that mentioned feeling unwell and needing to exit the aircraft. I didn't mention the footsteps, or the shadows, or the voices. I knew how that would sound. The airline suspended me for 2 weeks for deploying the emergency slide without proper authorization, and I didn't fight it. I did more research over those 2 weeks. I found records of the 1982 incident, found survivor interviews, found complaints from crew members over the years. Multiple flight attendants had refused to work on that particular aircraft. Several had reported similar experiences. Figures in the seats, voices, equipment activating on its own. But the airline had always dismissed it as superstition or overactive imaginations. The plane was mechanically sound, they said. Safe to fly. 3 months after my overnight experience, the airline finally retired that aircraft. It was flown to a desert facility and scrapped. I'd like to think that destroyed whatever was haunting it, that those shadow passengers finally found peace. But I don't know. I don't know if ghosts can haunt machines, or if trauma can imprint itself on metal and plastic and circuitry. I just know what I experienced that night. I still fly. I still work overnight shifts sometimes when needed. But I never volunteered to stay alone in an aircraft anymore. And I always check the registration number before I board for a shift. I look up the history, make sure there haven't been incidents, haven't been deaths. Because I learned that airplanes remember. They remember every passenger who ever sat in those seats. And sometimes, especially in the ones that have seen tragedy, those passengers never really leave. Would you feel comfortable spending a night alone in an empty airplane? Or does the idea terrify you? My name is Ronan, and I've been a flight attendant for 15 years. January 2020 was when the world started changing in ways none of us could have predicted. I was based out of San Francisco International Airport, working long-haul international routes that brought passengers from all corners of the globe. We were trained to handle medical emergencies, taught basic first aid, knew the protocols for dealing with sick passengers. But what happened on an arriving flight that month went far beyond any training I'd ever received. What I witnessed wasn't in any manual, wasn't part of any standard procedure, and the airline made very sure that nobody would ever hear the truth about what happened. It was January 23rd, a Thursday evening, and we were on the final approach into San Francisco after a 14-hour flight from an Asian hub. The aircraft was a wide body, completely full with about 300 passengers. Most people were tired, ready to get off the plane and go home or to their hotels. The flight had been routine up until about 40 minutes before landing. I was working the main cabin with Elise, a flight attendant who'd been with the airline for about 8 years. We'd just finished collecting trash and preparing the cabin for arrival when a passenger in row 18D started coughing. At first, it didn't seem unusual. People cough on airplanes all the time. Dry recycled air, allergies, colds, 100 different reasons. But this cough was violent, racking, the kind that makes you wince in sympathy. The passenger was a man in his 40s, business traveler by the look of his suit and laptop bag. I approached to ask if he needed water or anything else, and that's when I saw his face. He was sweating profusely, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes unfocused. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He tried to respond, but another coughing fit seized him. This time, when he coughed into his hand, I saw blood. Not a lot, just flecks of red on his palm, but enough to make alarm bells ring in my head. I called Elise over, and we moved the passenger to a more isolated area near the rear galley, following our protocols for potentially contagious passengers. We gave him a mask, tried to make him comfortable, and I went to inform the captain that we had a sick passenger who would need medical attention upon landing. That's when things started happening fast. Within 5 minutes of moving the first passenger, a woman in row 22A started showing similar symptoms: violent coughing, fever, sweating, then a teenager in row 31C, then an elderly man in row 9B. 4 passengers, all developing identical symptoms within minutes of each other. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how illness spread. I'd seen flu outbreaks on flights before, but not like this. Not this fast, not this synchronized. I returned to the cockpit and updated the captain. His voice was tense when he responded. "Stay calm and keep the passengers isolated. I'm contacting the airline and medical services now." I heard him on the radio, speaking in codes I didn't recognize, using terminology I'd never heard in 15 years of flying. When I went back to check on the sick passengers, I found that their conditions had deteriorated dramatically. The man from 18D was now bleeding from his eyes, actual blood tears running down his face. His skin had taken on a grayish tone, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface, spreading across his neck and face like black tree branches. Elise grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in through my uniform. "Ronan, what is happening? This isn't normal. This isn't any disease I've ever seen." She was right. The other 3 passengers were showing the same symptoms: the spreading black veins, the bleeding, the rapid deterioration. And they were all making this sound, a low moaning that wasn't quite human, that seemed to vibrate in a frequency that made my bones ache. We touched down in San Francisco, and instead of taxiing to a gate, the captain kept us on a remote part of the tarmac, far from the terminal. His voice came over the intercom, and I could hear the strain in every word. "Flight attendants, remain calm. We have a medical situation on board. Passengers, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Medical personnel will be boarding shortly." Through the window, I could see vehicles approaching. Not regular ambulances. These were specialized vehicles, unmarked white vans with tinted windows. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The captain received a message, and I heard him repeat it for confirmation. "Protocol Omega, understood. Initiating full quarantine procedures." I'd never heard of Protocol Omega. It wasn't in any of our training manuals, wasn't part of any emergency procedure I'd been taught. The captain's next words were directed at us, the crew. "Flight attendants, seal all exits. Nobody deplanes. This is now a containment situation." The aircraft doors, which should have been able to open from the inside, suddenly wouldn't budge. I tried the emergency exit handle, and it felt like it was welded shut. Electronic locks. Locks that we didn't control. Passengers were starting to panic, sensing that something was very wrong. People were standing up, demanding to know why we weren't letting them off. A businessman in first class was shouting about missing connections. A mother was crying, holding her young daughter. The sick passengers were getting worse. The black veins had spread across their entire bodies now, visible even through their clothing. They had stopped moaning and started convulsing, their bodies jerking in ways that didn't look natural, like they were being controlled by something else. And the smell. A horrible smell like rotting meat mixed with chemicals filled the cabin, making people gag and cover their faces. Armed personnel boarded the aircraft, not paramedics. These people were wearing full hazmat suits, the kind with self-contained breathing systems and multiple layers of protection. They carried weapons, actual firearms, though they kept them holstered. They moved straight to the sick passengers and surrounded them with some kind of portable containment barrier, clear plastic sheets that they erected around each person. I couldn't see what they were doing inside those barriers, but I heard sounds. Medical equipment beeping, people speaking in calm, clinical tones, and the patients screaming in voices that didn't sound human anymore. One of the hazmat personnel approached Elise and me. The voice through the suit's speaker was distorted, genderless, and mechanical. How long have these passengers been symptomatic? Did anyone else come into direct contact with them? We answered as best we could, but I could barely focus. I was watching through the translucent barrier as the man from 18D thrashed against restraints. His skin was splitting open, not bleeding but cracking like dried earth, and something dark was moving underneath. The hazmat team set up equipment throughout the cabin. Air filtration units that hummed and glowed with ultraviolet light. Scanning devices that they passed over every passenger, checking for something. When they scanned me, a small screen on the device flashed red. The operator's head snapped up. This one has been exposed. Mark for observation. They put a band around my wrist, bright orange, and did the same to Elise and 3 other crew members. About 40 passengers also received bands. Hours passed. We sat there on that remote tarmac, isolated from the rest of the airport, while the hazmat team worked. They removed the 4 sick passengers one by one, each in their own sealed containment unit that looked like a high-tech coffin. The barriers came down, and I could see where the patients had been. The seats were scorched, actually burned through in places, and there was residue on the carpet, black and oily and moving slightly, even though nothing was touching it. They started processing the passengers. Everyone was forced to submit to examinations, blood draws, biometric scans. People who resisted were restrained, not violently, but firmly, by personnel who wouldn't answer any questions. The orange-banded group, including me and Elise, were separated from the others. We were told we would be going to a specialized facility for observation. When I asked how long, the hazmat worker said, minimum 72 hours, possibly longer depending on results. The non-exposed passengers were eventually released, but not before signing documents. I saw the papers, thick legal forms with dense text and highlighted sections about federal prosecution and national security. People signed because they wanted to go home, wanted to leave this nightmare. But their faces showed they knew something terrible had happened, something they weren't being told the truth about. Elise and I, along with the other exposed crew and passengers, were transported to a facility that wasn't a hospital. It was a government building, windowless and heavily secured, somewhere in the East Bay. We were kept in individual rooms, examined every 6 hours, given medications we weren't allowed to question. The medical staff wouldn't tell us what they were testing for, what the sick passengers had been infected with, or whether we were in danger. On the 3rd day, a man in a suit visited my room. No name, no identification, just a manila folder and a very serious expression. The passengers from your flight who became ill are being treated at a classified facility. You will not be given information about their condition. You have been exposed to a biological agent that should not exist outside of controlled laboratory environments. You are not infected. You are being released. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement. You will not discuss this incident with anyone. Violation of this agreement will result in federal prosecution under laws related to national security. Do you understand? I signed. What choice did I have? They gave me back my belongings, returned me to my apartment, and made it clear that I was being watched. The airline scrubbed every record of the incident. The flight manifest was altered to show an earlier arrival time and a normal deplaning process. Passengers who tried to talk about what happened found their social media posts deleted, their videos removed, their stories dismissed as conspiracy theories or attention-seeking lies. I tried to research what had happened. I found nothing about Protocol Omega in any public database. The facility where we'd been quarantined didn't officially exist according to property records. I tried to contact other crew members who'd been there. 2 wouldn't talk to me. One said she couldn't remember the details clearly anymore, like the memories were fading or being suppressed somehow. Elise moved to a different city and changed her phone number. But I did find something. 3 months after the incident, I was doing a routine international flight and happened to glance at a cargo manifest. There was a container being transported to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. The shipping code was familiar. I'd seen it before on paperwork from that January flight. I looked it up later. The code designation was for biological specimens requiring Level 4 containment protocols, the same level used for the most dangerous pathogens known to science. Ebola, smallpox, things that could kill millions if released. I tried to find death records for the 4 passengers who'd been removed from our flight. 2 of them had obituaries, normal deaths, heart attack, car accident. But the dates of death were listed as weeks before our flight. They were already dead, according to official records, before they'd ever boarded that plane. The other 2 passengers had no records at all. No death certificates, no Social Security records after January 23, 2020. They simply ceased to exist in any database I could access. I still fly international routes. I still see cargo being loaded, sealed containers marked with biohazard symbols and CDC seals. And I wonder what else is being transported on these flights. What other biological agents or experiments or classified materials are moving through the air above our heads? I wonder if Protocol Omega has been activated on other flights, in other countries, with other crews who were forced to sign away their right to speak the truth. The orange band left a mark on my wrist that took weeks to fade. Sometimes I can still see it, a faint discoloration on my skin, a reminder of those hours in quarantine. A reminder that there are protocols in place for situations that officially don't exist. And a reminder that sometimes, when people get sick on airplanes, it's not just a cold or the flu. Sometimes it's something much worse. Something that governments will do anything to keep secret. If you suddenly got sick on a flight and watched the people around you develop the same symptoms within minutes, what would you think was happening? My name is Atreus, and I've been a flight attendant for 10 years. May 2012 was when I learned that reality isn't as solid as we believe it to be. That the world we perceive can shift and change in ways that make you question your own sanity. I was based out of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, working domestic routes throughout the Pacific Northwest. What happened on what should have been a routine afternoon flight taught me that sometimes you can be in a place that looks exactly like where you're supposed to be, but isn't. Sometimes you can be trapped in something that resembles reality, but operates by completely different rules. And the worst part is when nobody else notices that anything is wrong. It was May 15th, a Tuesday afternoon, and the flight was scheduled to depart at 1 p.m. heading to Portland. It was a short hop, barely 45 minutes in the air, the kind of route we called a puddle jumper. The aircraft was a smaller regional jet with about 70 seats, and we had a full load of passengers. Mostly business travelers making the quick trip between cities, a few families, some college students. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, no complications expected. I was working with Noah, a flight attendant who'd been with the airline for about 6 years. We'd flown together dozens of times and had a comfortable working relationship. Boarding was completely normal. Passengers filed on, stowed their bags, settled into their seats. I helped an elderly woman find space for her carry-on, answered questions about arrival times, did the usual pre-flight checks. Everything felt routine. Everything felt exactly like the hundreds of other flights I'd worked. We pushed back from the gate right on time at 1 p.m. The captain came on the intercom and gave his standard greeting, mentioned the flight time and weather conditions. The engine started up and we began taxiing toward the runway. That's when I first noticed something odd. We were taxiing for what seemed like a long time, longer than usual for this airport. I'd worked out of Seattle-Tacoma for years and knew the layout well. The taxi to the runway typically took maybe 10 or 15 minutes at most. But we kept moving, the engines humming steadily, the plane rolling forward but never stopping for takeoff. I glanced at my watch. We'd been taxiing for 20 minutes, then 25, then 30. I looked out the window, trying to orient myself. The airport looked different somehow. The terminals were the right general shape, but the details were wrong. The windows were in slightly different positions. The colors of the buildings were off, like someone had repainted everything in shades that were close, but not quite right. The other aircraft I could see on the tarmac looked strange too. The designs were familiar, but old-fashioned, like planes from decades ago mixed with modern jets in ways that didn't make sense. Passengers were starting to notice the extended taxi time. A businessman across the aisle checked his watch and frowned. A woman a few rows back called out, "Excuse me, how much longer until we take off?" I smiled and said we'd be airborne shortly, that there was probably just some congestion on the runway. But I didn't believe my own words. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, that deep instinctual knowledge that you're in danger even when you can't identify why. I went to the cockpit and knocked. The captain opened the door a crack. "Yes?" he said, sounding slightly annoyed. "Sir, we've been taxiing for over 30 minutes. Is everything all right?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We're next for takeoff. Just a few more minutes. Return to your station." His voice was flat, emotionless. And when he closed the door, I heard the lock click with a finality that sent chills down my spine. I found Noah in the galley. She was staring out the small window with a confused expression. "Atreus, does the airport look weird to you? The buildings look wrong somehow." I nodded, relief flooding through me that I wasn't the only one noticing. "We've been taxiing for over 30 minutes. That's not normal. And the captain just brushed me off when I asked about it." She bit her lip. "Should we say something to the passengers?" I didn't know. What would we say? That we were lost on our own airport? That reality seemed to be malfunctioning? Another 20 minutes passed. We were still taxiing. Passengers were getting restless now, some standing up despite the seatbelt sign, demanding answers. I made an announcement asking everyone to remain seated, that we'd be taking off very soon. But I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. I looked out the window again. The sky had changed color. It was still daylight, but the quality of the light was different, more orange than it should be, like perpetual sunset, even though it was only 2 p.m. Or was it? I checked my watch. It said 2:17 p.m., but it felt like hours had passed. The other flight attendant, the lead who was supposed to be working with us, was acting strange. I realized I hadn't seen her since we pushed back. I went looking and found her sitting in a passenger seat near the rear, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. "Are you okay?" I asked. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. Her eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them, like looking at a mannequin. I touched her shoulder, and she was cold, unnaturally cold, like touching marble. Panic started creeping in. I returned to Noah and told her what I'd found. Her face went pale. "This isn't right. None of this is right. We need to get off this plane." But how? We were moving, still rolling forward on this endless taxi, and the doors were sealed. The emergency exits wouldn't open while we were in motion, and even if they did, we were on an active taxiway. We were trapped. I started paying closer attention to the passengers, really looking at them for the first time since we'd started this impossible taxi. Most of them seemed normal, reading or working on laptops or sleeping. But some of them were wrong. A man in row 8 had been reading the same page of his newspaper the entire time, his eyes not moving, not blinking. A woman in row 14 was smiling, just sitting there with her hands folded in her lap and this serene smile on her face, smiling at nothing for over an hour. A child in row 3 was drawing in a coloring book, but when I walked past, I saw she was using a black crayon to fill in the entire page, over and over, the paper torn through in places from the pressure. I looked at my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual for an aircraft, but I should have had at least roaming service. The screen showed the time as 2:45 p.m., but it also showed the date as May 15th, 2012. Then I blinked, and it showed May 15th, 1987. Then May 15th, 2034. The date kept flickering, changing, like the phone couldn't decide when we were. I showed it to Noah and watched her hands start shaking. Another 30 minutes passed. We were still taxiing. The airport outside had changed again. Now I could see terminals that definitely didn't exist, architecture that was futuristic and impossible. Through gaps between buildings, I saw what looked like Seattle's skyline. But the Space Needle was a different color, and there were buildings I didn't recognize. Skyscrapers that shouldn't exist. The sky was definitely wrong now, that orange color darkening to purple in places, with clouds that moved too fast and in patterns that clouds shouldn't move. I made a decision. I grabbed the intercom and spoke directly to the passengers, breaking every protocol I'd been taught. "This is your flight attendant speaking. I need everyone to listen carefully. Something is wrong with this flight. We've been taxiing for over 2 hours. The airport outside doesn't look right. If anyone else has noticed these things, if anyone else feels like something is wrong, I need you to say something now." There was silence for a moment. Then a man in row 11 stood up. "I thought I was losing my mind. We should have taken off an hour ago, and my phone keeps showing different dates." A woman in row 19 started crying. The buildings outside keep changing. I saw a terminal that wasn't there a minute ago. More passengers started speaking up, confirming they'd noticed the impossible things, the wrongness, the sense that we were trapped in something that only resembled reality. But others just stared at us like we were crazy. The businessman in row 8 with the newspaper looked up and said in a perfectly calm voice, "The flight is proceeding normally. Please return to your seats." The smiling woman in row 14 kept smiling. The child kept coloring her black pages. About half the passengers seemed aware that something was wrong. The other half seemed to be part of whatever this was, agents of this false reality or victims who couldn't see the truth. Noah grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Atreus, look at the cockpit door." I turned. The door was opening and closing rhythmically, just a few inches, like it was breathing. Through the gap I could see the flight deck, but it was wrong. The instruments were melting, dripping like wax. The windscreen showed not the taxiway, but something else. Something dark and vast and moving. And I could hear voices from inside. Multiple voices, speaking in unison, saying things in languages I didn't understand. I tried the emergency exit. I didn't care anymore about protocols or procedures. I just needed to get out. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It moved, but instead of opening to the taxiway, it opened to nothing. Literally nothing. A void. Empty space that was neither dark nor light, just absence. I slammed it shut, my heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. Then everything stopped. The plane stopped moving. The engines went silent. For a moment, everything was completely still. I looked at Noah. She looked at me. The aware passengers held their breath. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom. But it was wrong, layered with static and undertones that sounded like screaming. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our destination. Welcome to Portland. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." But we weren't in Portland. We couldn't be. We'd never taken off. The engines had never accelerated for takeoff. We'd just been taxiing, endlessly taxiing through an airport that kept changing. Yet through the windows, I could see a gate, a jetway extending toward our door, ground crew approaching with equipment. Everything looked normal now. The airport was back to the right configuration. The sky was the right color. My watch showed 1:47 p.m. Only 47 minutes had passed according to the time. That was impossible. The cabin door opened. Passengers started gathering their belongings, standing up, moving toward the exit like everything was normal. The ones who'd been aware, who'd spoken up about the wrongness, now looked confused. "Was it really that bad?" one woman asked. "Maybe I was just anxious about flying." They were forgetting, already forgetting. Their minds were rewriting the experience into something acceptable, something that fit with normal reality. I deplaned with the passengers, walking on legs that barely supported me. The airport was normal, completely, boringly normal. Ground crew worked around the aircraft. Other planes taxied past. The sky was a regular May afternoon sky. But when I checked my phone, I had messages from friends sent over the past 3 hours. 3 hours that had passed in the real world while we'd experienced something else. And buried in my message history was a text I didn't remember sending, sent at 1:15 p.m. that just said, "We never left, we never left, we never left," over and over for 200 words. I filed an incident report. The airline dismissed it. The flight logs showed a normal flight time of 47 minutes. Security footage showed normal boarding, normal taxi, normal takeoff and landing. Noah filed a report too. They suggested she take time off for stress. The passengers I tried to contact afterward either didn't remember anything unusual or refused to talk about it. I still fly. I still work that Seattle to Portland route sometimes. But I watch the taxi time carefully now. I count the minutes. And I wonder if we ever really made it back. Or if we're still somewhere in between, still taxiing through an airport that shifts and changes, still trapped in a flight that never ends. Because sometimes when I look out the aircraft window during taxi, just for a moment, I see those wrong-colored buildings, those impossible terminals, that orange sky. And I wonder if this reality is the real one, or if we only think it is. Have you ever felt like time stopped making sense? like you were trapped in a moment that should have ended but kept going forever? My name is Attendant, and I've been a flight attendant for 18 years. November 2008 was when I learned that some traditions are older than civilization, that some rituals have been performed for so long they've become woven into the fabric of reality itself, and that sometimes the modern world collides with ancient practices in ways that are absolutely terrifying. I was based out of Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, working regional routes throughout the Midwest. What happened on a Thanksgiving week flight over rural America taught me that bloodlines matter, that some debts get passed down through generations, and that when you're chosen for something, fighting it might be worse than accepting it. It was November 26th, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and the flight was completely booked. Everyone was heading home for the holiday, the airports packed with families and college students and business travelers trying to get to their destinations before the big day. The flight was scheduled to depart at 3:30 p.m., a short regional hop over farmland and small towns, landing at a smaller airport in rural Wisconsin. The aircraft was a smaller jet, maybe 90 seats, and every single one was full. I was working with Elena, a flight attendant who'd been with the airline for about 12 years. We'd flown together many times and had developed the kind of efficient teamwork that comes from experience. Boarding was chaotic in the way Thanksgiving flights always are. Families with young children, elderly couples, people carrying pies and covered dishes because they didn't trust airport security with their holiday contributions. I helped passengers find space in the overhead bins, redirected people to their correct seats, answered questions about connecting flights. Everything felt normal. Everything felt like the dozens of other holiday flights I'd worked over the years. We pushed back from the gate right on time, and the captain announced we'd be flying over some beautiful autumn farmland on our way to our destination. About 30 minutes into the flight, I started noticing something odd. The passengers were behaving strangely. Not all of them, but enough to catch my attention. They were whispering to each other, but not in the normal way people chat on airplanes. They were whispering in unison, saying the same words at the same time. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the synchronization was unnerving. A woman in row 8, a man in row 15, a teenage girl in row 22, all whispering identical phrases in perfect timing with each other. I caught Elena's attention and gestured toward the whispering passengers. She'd noticed it too, her face showing confusion and concern. "What are they saying?" she asked quietly. I moved closer to the woman in row 8, pretending to check seatbelts, and listened carefully. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, not Spanish or French or any modern language I'd heard. It sounded old, guttural, with harsh consonants and rolling vowels that seemed to come from deep in the throat. More passengers joined in. Soon, maybe 50 of the 90 people on board were whispering in that strange language, all perfectly synchronized, all staring straight ahead with glazed expressions. The other passengers were starting to notice, looking around nervously, parents pulling their children closer. A businessman across the aisle from me leaned over. "What's happening? Why are they all doing that?" I had no answer to give him. Then the whispering stopped. All at once, complete silence except for the drone of the engines. The synchronized passengers stood up simultaneously, moving into the aisle with mechanical precision. They didn't speak to each other, didn't acknowledge each other, just stood there in perfect stillness. Elena grabbed the intercom to tell them to return to their seats. But before she could speak, they all began moving. Not walking, moving, gliding almost, their feet barely seeming to touch the floor. And they formed a circle in the center of the cabin. I tried to approach them, to break up whatever was happening. But the moment I got close, I felt resistance. Not physical, but something else. The air itself seemed solid, like an invisible wall preventing me from getting near their circle. Other passengers who tried to move past them experienced the same thing. We were trapped in our sections of the cabin, unable to cross into the space where the ritual was happening. Because that's what it was. A ritual. The passengers in the circle began chanting, louder now, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that shouldn't have been possible without practice. They pulled items from their pockets and bags. Small objects I couldn't identify at first. Bones. They were bones. Old, yellowed bones. Some carved with symbols, some tied together with ancient-looking cord. They placed them on the floor in the center of their circle, arranging them in a pattern that hurt to look at, a geometry that seemed wrong somehow. One of them, an elderly woman who'd seemed completely normal during boarding, stepped forward. She pulled out a knife. An actual knife? Somehow smuggled through security or maybe conjured from nothing, I couldn't tell anymore. She held it up and the other passengers in the circle responded with a word that made my teeth ache when I heard it. A name. They were calling something. Summoning something. The elderly woman began speaking in English now, and what she said made my blood freeze. She was reciting names. Family names, genealogies. And she said my last name. My family name that I'd never told anyone on this flight, that wasn't on any visible documentation. The daughter of the line, the blood of the soil, the one who returns. She turned and looked directly at me, her eyes completely white, no iris or pupil visible. Attendant, born of the town below, marked from birth. The covenant must be renewed. I felt Elena grab my arm. What is she talking about? What covenant? I didn't know. I had no idea what any of this meant. But then I started remembering things. Stories my grandmother had told me when I was very young. Stories I dismissed as fairy tales. About our family. About the town we'd come from in rural Wisconsin. About old agreements. About rituals performed every 50 years. About daughters of certain bloodlines who had to participate, or the crops would fail and the town would suffer. I looked out the window. We were circling. Not in a normal holding pattern, but in precise circles. 7 of them, over a specific area of farmland below. Through breaks in the clouds, I could see a small town. Buildings arranged in patterns that looked wrong from this height. Roads that curved in spirals rather than grids. And I recognized it. Even though I'd never been there, even though my family had left 3 generations ago, I recognized it. The town where my ancestors had lived. The town that apparently still had a claim on me. The passengers in the circle began cutting themselves. Small cuts on their palms, letting blood drip onto the bones they'd arranged on the floor. The blood didn't pool naturally. It moved with purpose, flowing in patterns, forming symbols. The elderly woman called out again. The chosen must join willingly, or the binding cannot hold. The chosen must give blood, or the contract cannot renew. Come, daughter of the soil. Come and complete what was begun 5 decades before your birth. I felt a pull, a physical sensation like hooks in my chest, tugging me toward the circle. My feet started moving against my will, carrying me toward them. Elena tried to hold me back, but her hands passed through me like I was smoke. Other passengers who tried to help found they couldn't touch me. I was becoming something else. Something that existed partially in their world, and partially in whatever reality this ritual was creating. I reached the edge of the circle, and the invisible barrier that had kept others out let me pass through easily. The passengers surrounded me, still chanting, still bleeding onto the floor. The elderly woman held out the knife. "1 drop. That is all the covenant requires. 1 drop of blood from the daughter of the line, given willingly at the appointed time over the appointed ground. And the town will thrive for another 50 years. Refuse, and the curse falls upon you instead. You will carry the weight of all the suffering that follows." I looked at the knife. I looked at the faces around me. People who moments ago had been normal holiday travelers and now were vessels for something ancient. I looked at Elena, who was pounding against the invisible barrier, screaming for the captain, trying desperately to reach me. I looked out the window at the town below, circling 7 times as we had circled, bound by traditions older than flight itself. And I understood something horrible. This had been planned. Every passenger in this circle had been placed on this specific flight deliberately. The route had been chosen to pass over this specific town at this specific time. The airline didn't know, the captain didn't know, but someone had arranged it. Someone who kept the old ways, someone who tracked bloodlines and knew when the 50-year cycle would come around again and who the chosen daughter would be. I felt the knife being pressed into my hand. I felt the chanting grow louder, more insistent. And I felt something else. A connection to the people who'd done this before me. My great-great-grandmother, who'd stood in a field at midnight and cut her palm for the harvest. My ancestor before her, who'd given blood under a full moon. Back and back through generations, women of my bloodline participating in this ritual, keeping the covenant, maintaining the balance. The plane shuddered. We were descending. No, not descending. Being pulled down. The town below was pulling us toward it, drawing us into its orbit like a planet with its own gravity. The captain's voice came over the intercom, confused and frightened. "We're experiencing some kind of equipment malfunction. I've lost control of the aircraft. Everyone brace for emergency procedures." But the passengers in the circle weren't bracing. They were reaching the climax of their ritual. I made a choice. I don't know if it was the right choice, or if there even was a right choice. I pressed the knife to my palm and let a single drop of blood fall. It hit the bone pattern on the floor, and everything changed. The blood flared with light that shouldn't exist, burning without heat, spreading across the symbols in rivers of illumination. The chanting reached a crescendo and then stopped. The passengers in the circle collapsed, falling to their seats like puppets with cut strings. And the plane suddenly had altitude control again. The captain regained control just before we would have entered unsafe descent. He pulled us back up to cruising altitude, his voice shaking as he announced that we'd experienced a technical issue, but everything was now resolved. We'd be landing at our destination shortly. The passengers who'd been part of the ritual woke up confused, with no memory of what had happened. They looked at their cut palms with bewilderment, wondering where the injuries had come from. Only the elderly woman remained aware. She looked at me from across the cabin and smiled. Then she whispered, so quietly that only I could hear despite the distance between us. 50 years, daughter. Your daughter's daughter will stand where you stood. The covenant continues. And then she closed her eyes and became just an elderly woman again, tired from travel, ready to see her family for Thanksgiving. We landed normally. Passengers deplaned, heading to their holiday celebrations, unaware that they'd been part of something ancient and terrible. Elena pulled me aside. What happened? What did you do? I showed her my palm. The cut was already healing, sealing itself at an impossible rate. I did what my bloodline has always done. I paid a debt I didn't know I owed. I did research over the following months. I found records of my family going back centuries. found documentation of the town below, its unusual prosperity, its survival through droughts and depressions that had destroyed surrounding communities. Found mentions in old documents of the renewal and the daughter's gift happening in regular cycles. And I found a birth record that made me sick. I have a niece. She's 8 years old now. In 42 years, when November 26th falls on a Wednesday again, someone will book her on a specific flight over a specific town, and she'll have to make the same choice I made. I still fly. I still work Thanksgiving routes. But I've requested permanent transfer away from any flights that pass over that region of Wisconsin. I've tried to warn my family, but they don't believe me. They think I experienced some kind of stress-induced delusion. Maybe that's easier than believing the truth. That some traditions never die. That some contracts bind generations that haven't even been born yet. That sometimes when you're up in the air, you're not as far from the ground as you think. Do you believe some families carry curses or obligations that pass down through bloodlines? Or is it all just superstition? That's all for tonight's terrifying journey through the skies. I'm Mr. Nightveil, and I hope these stories have given you a new perspective on your next flight. If you enjoyed these true accounts from flight attendants, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more disturbing tales. Leave a comment telling me which story disturbed you the most. Until next time, stay safe and remember, sometimes the scariest things happen where you least expect them.